So again, we're talking trends in church safety and security. Most of you know who I am. I'm Sandy Coelho, and I serve at the Baptist Churches of New England in the area of leadership development. And I am so honored every time that I get to bring this type of training to you. And I'm so happy that we can do all of these different webinars, especially in the area of evangelism. And those of you that might have 3 or more from your church on tonight, you could be eligible for that $250 evangelism grant. So I'll send you that link as well when I send out the link to the recording. So again, so glad that you could be with us tonight. And let me introduce my special guest. His name is Dr. Dan Fitzsimons, and he is the founder of New England Faith-Based Security Alliance. So Dan, welcome. Here he comes. So glad you're with us. Dan, tell us,
Sandy.
How are you?
Very good.
Good. So before I disappear and give it to you, tell us a little bit about you and how you, got started with, helping our churches.
Sure. Thank you for having me, folks. I really appreciate this opportunity. And this is really a ministry for me. I'm a retired Army officer, spent 32 years in the Army. I've owned multiple businesses along the way. But about 10 years ago, the Lord placed it on my heart to take a whole nother direction with my life, which was this one. And it kind of surprised me. I ended up writing the first academically sourced, peer-reviewed piece on protecting houses of worship in the 6 states of New England about 6 years ago. And I have a doctorate in strategic security, a master's in homeland security, another in counterterrorism, and a fair amount of experience in this world. I've been protecting my personal church, East Auburn Baptist Church in Auburn, Maine, for the past 10 years, and I'm part of the leadership group with that. But in the last few years, the Lord's really sent me in another direction, which is a much bigger circle. I also lead for a national organization named the Faith-Based Security Network. I'm their Region 1 leader, which is the 6 states of New England. We follow the FEMA organization system. New England Faith-Based Security Alliance, LLC, is a mechanism that I'm using to train folks with and to really focus hard on these 6 states in New England. I've managed in my short life, I'm 66 years old, live in Turner, Maine, live in 4 of the 6 states.
Wow.
I was
Awesome.
born in Connecticut, lived in Vermont, I've lived in New Hampshire, I've lived in Maine. I've spent a whole bunch of time outside of Massachusetts, but I can't say that I actually had a living address there, right? And the only one that I haven't lived in is Rhode Island, but I had been in Musquamaca Beach a bunch of times, so that kind of counts.
Okay.
I've lived over a span of my adult life, I've lived in 17 different states and countries, and so I've been all over the place. With this particular mission of church safety and security, I've been to every corner of the United States, both studying and working with other congregations on this particular issue, because New England is rather unique in how we approach this problem. We are not Alabama, we're not Texas, this isn't Florida. It's a whole nother thing. And we have a lot of very small churches that have a need to do this same problem with lesser resources. And so, Sandy, if we can go to the next slide, that would be really good.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to then disappear, and I'm just going to make sure that people know that there'll be a resource sheet with the information that you share tonight. And just to remind people that they can ask questions in the chat, and I've already put that up there for them. So, and I'll be listening to see if there are any questions. So I'll be back on later.
Perfect. That's just a little bit about who I am. Next, please. So this is what we're going to do tonight. I broke it into 3 steps because this is not a simple subject. We're going to develop the problem and why New England is quite different. There's a difference between what we do in a small church and what we do in a large congregation. It's just a reality. How does peacekeeping fit into this world of evangelism? Because if folks are unsure of what's going on in the greater public, it's a good chance they're not coming to your building. There's legal issues involved, and they're various, and they're different in all 6 states. Becoming intentional about what you do is really at the heart of the training. We have to move from a place of just any old thing happening to we intend this to occur. We're looking for a specific outcome. And that specific outcome is in the name of my company, keeping peace in God's house. It's as straightforward as that. We want to keep peace in God's house. It's a simple statement, but not so easy to do. And then we're about building a team. Who is the people that are needed to do this? Because this, to be intentional, requires that you have the right people, the right resources. Next, please. All right. This might surprise you. This is low to high. Who's got the most violent crime in New England? Well, I'll start. My state, Maine, is actually the lowest. This is a very recent study. Next is, believe it or not, Rhode Island. Vermont's in the middle. Massachusetts and Connecticut is the worst. I would have thought it was going to be Massachusetts, but it's really Connecticut. Every one of those states. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention another thing. I'm on the board of directors of something called InfraGuard, which is we work directly with the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Security Agency on protecting houses of worship throughout the 6 states. And I do just Maine, but we're focused on a bigger picture. And that's how I get some of my data. Every one of these states has seen a massive hop in violent crime in the last 18 months. It's just staggering. I was listening to a report last night from Portland, Maine. Beautiful place, sailboats, restaurants, all that nice stuff. They've doubled their firearms engagement rates in 1 year. Literally doubled it. So these numbers you hear from New York City and Chicago, they're not just isolated to big places. They're ending up in small locations now. My own town, or near my town, Auburn, Maine, they just had a shooting just yesterday, officer-involved shooting. These things are happening consistently now. And so, does New England have a safety security problem? We're not that different than the rest of the nation. That's the bottom line. We might feel different, but the numbers are there, and we kind of keep it on the down low. Next one, please. These are FBI statistics on very specific periods of time. And you can see this gigantic jump that's underway in violent crime. Now, these are specific hate crime statistics. So when we're talking about churches, houses of worship, hate crimes are where this is going, right? You can see how it breaks down. Race, ethnicity, ancestry, big. But right behind it is faith. Now, what we're not seeing is anti-Islamic problems. Now, when I first started this process, I think, okay, this might be like counterterrorism. We're not seeing that. What we're seeing is generalized violence, some of it very specific to, I would easily call it anti-Christian, plain and simple. Anti-Semitism's on the rise, and their numbers are booting up too, but the anti-Christian numbers are up there. As you can see, the rest of it, sexual orientation, gender, disability, all those numbers are small compared to race and religion. It's just what it is. Now, the reason why these numbers stop in 2020 is the FBI is usually 2 to 3 years behind on their uniform crime reporting information. So you're not going to have the most current things. If we trended this stuff out, the chart wouldn't be big enough to cover the numbers. It would just go through the moon. Next, please. Why is New England different? Now, I'm not trying to insult anybody or, we're better than you or any of this kind of thing. This is just as a person who's lived in New England and all over the country, there's a difference between the folks who live here and the folks who don't live here. If you weren't born here, this is from Maine, then you're from away. It's as straightforward as that. We still have neighborhoods, communities that are very much ethnic oriented, very much so. They might think that they're multiculturalistic, but it's really not. I haven't seen too much of that. If you're not from here, you're really from some other place, which leads to the kind of how churches come into play here. People in New England are in their cars a lot. That's just a personal impression. When I see all these cars moving all the time, I've been to Los Angeles and all, they're doing the same thing there. But when you're here, if you live in Vermont, you're in your car all the time. You're in Maine, you're in your car all the time. For me, to go to Walmart, it takes 20 something minutes. And so that means just to get there and back to the house, that's 40 minutes of travel time. That's like a long way. I mean, and that's as common as can be. There's plenty of people that drive great distances. The church people in Maine, or I should say in New England in general, are pretty friendly, but they're very guarded. I see some hugging, but it's none of this hugging your neck stuff like I've known in Alabama and Georgia and Texas. I've lived in all those places, Florida. We're just not that way. We're not, some people are huggers, but not that many. Rural can mean different things in our region than in other parts of the country. So I was raised in Hamden, Connecticut. Nice place, right? It's changed dramatically. New Haven, Bridgeport's changed dramatically. What I considered a rural place where I grew up is now not that at all. I live in a farm town in Maine that is rapidly expanding from Portland, and it's no longer just a dairy town. It's changing and changing fast. That has an effect on congregations. I spent a little bit of time with the folks at what used to be Bangor Theological Institute up in Bangor, Maine, and they used to talk about this next piece here. Church and community are almost interchangeable in New England, especially in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Church is a gathering point, especially in the smaller places. And because of that, we know a lot about each other that are in these tight organizations. But if I go back to the crime talk, crime is breaking that down, and that's a big problem. And lastly, I put down here, pastors, they're rather approachable. You can actually talk to your pastor. I worked with a group out of Houston 2 years ago, big mega church, and I mean mega. Like I think there was a 6,000 person auditorium in campus with a dozen buildings on it. You didn't just go hello to the pastor. That didn't happen. He had his own security team and the whole thing. It was not a thing. Here, we're a little bit different. Next, Sandy. Can you click the next slide? There we go. I get intelligence drops every day from the things I'm involved in. And we're seeing social disruptions just about everywhere in New England. This is a real problem. When I mean social disruptions, the usual interconnection, the fiber that holds a community together is starting to come unglued. And this is a problem. You can't have people hating each other. This is no good, right? The good old days really have been replaced. I've just finished reading for the third time. I'll try to hold it up. You guys can probably see this. Yeah. I found this to be an extremely important book, especially for pastors. It's called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. And that's, I believe, where we're headed. The good old days that were here 30 years ago have disappeared. And a lot of folks are struggling to find out just where do I go and how do I take this forward? It's important to understand the changes, and more important, to be flexible, to be able to go forward. There is which feeds all this, is a literal global decline in institutional trust. This is the references for it. If you want to look it up, the Edelman Trust Barometer, this is very new. This is like a month old. What they're looking at here is how do people view large institutions that they're used to working with, to include faith institutions, governments, hospitals, medical providers, all the, on a global basis, not just the United States, this is everywhere. Folks are starting to distrust the things that they have trust in, which again, we're back to safety and security inside of that community, right? Which is the congregations in New England, community-based. It's important. Folks are actually hearing so much bad stuff, it's blowing their minds. My perspective, we've become a modern day Tower of Babel. There's all kinds of talk all the time, blowing people's minds up like, oh, it's all this terrible stuff. They stop listening to each other while they're building towers to the sky, which is their thinking is going to help them. But it's really not. We're going back, we have to go backwards a little bit towards that building community. Next, please. Small versus large. These are really basic numbers. And this is what I'm using. There are other studies, Barna and others that have studies on this, but this is for me is simple enough. And I see this a lot because I travel about and visit a lot of congregations. If your average attendance is about 50 people, that's not unusual, right? The challenge is you've got seats for 150, and so the church looks empty. You have an aging population. You've not really experienced any kind of big commotion or violence, and so this has been a pretty safe place to be. What I'm seeing is sharing pastors, especially in these smaller communities where they no longer have enough professional clerical support clergy support to keep the ministries going. Well, jumping forward to a medium-sized church, about 300, they have a stabilized population, they have kids, they have experienced conflicts, but this is an important piece. The FBI crime recording system estimates that we only hear about 40 to 45% of the actual events that happen inside a church. So in other words, over half of the bad things that happen never reach the police department. They never end up on a police docket. They never end up with anybody being charged. There's a lot of reasons for this, the bad press, all that kind of thing. But it means some of the statistics that we're looking at as far as crimes inside houses of worship could easily be twice the numbers than what we see published at the FBI level. In medium-sized churches, usually have a full-time staff, which complicates the issue of safety and security. Next, Sandy. What's a disruption? Well, it's really anything that threatens or intimidates people. It's really that simple. Narcotics is a big one. So I just saw this last weekend with our congregation. Heroin addict banging on doors. And this is a large church. We easily 600-700 people at a time. Well known to the church, smashing on things, moving through spaces, freaking people out. This is disruptive behavior. Do you want it to continue? If you're in a small congregation of 50 or less, and most of them are seniors, you really don't want this happening. This is bad because people will stop coming. Next slide, please. So who are these peacekeepers that you're going to be looking for? Well, they can come in a couple of different varieties. The most favorable ones, the one the Department of Homeland Security, The federal government encourages, the state government encourages hiring police officers or paid professionals. That's their top thing, right? They usually cost $75 to $150 an hour. And unless you're a large congregation, you're not doing that. That's what my impression has been. Unpaid volunteers, that's the most common. I only know of a few congregations in New England that have paid security staff. One is a large congregation down in Bloomfield, Connecticut. There's others around, but there's not that many. It's expensive to do this. And if you hire cops, then you're going to have to set aside a significant amount of money to cover this. Which leads to who's a good Samaritan? Well, what I'm finding is it's a wide range of people that feel this touch on their heart saying, you know what, I think I can do something. I think I can help out. Are they intending to be security officers when they started life? No, but they're ending up here, which is not a bad idea. Evangelism needs these peacekeepers. So if you have, in order to get people to come back to your congregation to hear the gospel message, they have to feel safe. You're acting as a host, and as a host, you're asking people to join you, right? Then I'm not going there. There's full of drug addicts and crazy guys and people that are, you know, scary, and all these homeless guys, they smell bad, all this stuff. They'll scare them away, right? You've got to find a way to manage your congregation, the community that you're in, and make it feel safe. I've worked with a downtown church that's had multiple death threats on the pastors. They have a really interesting street group that goes there, but we're actually managed their way through it. And folks can do this. It can be done. Next, please. So how do you decide if you actually need safety and security? Well, does anybody have any questions so far? I've just kind of built the reasons why we're doing this. Is it making sense so far? Okay, Sandy, next.
Yeah, so just a reminder for people, just remember, we want you to be using the chat if you have questions, because I do think, Dan, you're certainly sharing a good foundation here. So, okay. You know, but if people have questions, so stick with them, because I think the pieces will fit together as you go along here. So that's great. But want to just continue to remind people to use the chat if they have questions. Sure.
Thank you. Risk assessments. Next slide, please. All right, risk assessments. This is at the very heart of the start of like risk management. First problem you have to know is you have a problem in the first place. And getting that done professionally can be fairly expensive. And in New England, there's not that many agencies that are there for you. It's truly important, I believe, to have new eyes look at things. You're used to seeing your place all the time. It's just what it looks like, right? When I walk through a property, or other folks like myself walk through a property, they don't see what you see. They see something completely different, and you can just go right past it. Even if you've got very sophisticated camera systems and fancy doors and, you know, bulletproof glass and all this kind of stuff, there's always problems. The local fire, law enforcement, EMS, they will frequently help you do this walkthrough, especially if it's a small community in a like in Vermont or New Hampshire, Maine. They're good with this. Now, CISA, Department of Homeland Security, CISA is a very large agency. They're equally the size of the Coast Guard. They're not a small group. And they're focused on protecting the infrastructure of the United States. And they consider houses of worship part of that. They have people that will do a full-on federal risk assessment of your facility. Now, they like to do big ones, but they're not, you know, all you do is ask them. What they won't talk about is they won't talk about guns. That's one of their things. They'll talk about everything, but they won't talk about guns. It's just how it is. And insurance companies generally have a do-it-yourself assessment tool. They'll have published, like Brotherhood Mutual, they have things you can get that you can literally just do it yourself and it will lead to like conclusions. This kind of makes sense. Associations like mine or the Faith-Based Security Network, I do have willing members that can help with these things. It's a function of asking. Next, please. Here's where I have to throw a big, what do you call it, caveat into this. I'm not an attorney. I've studied many, many legal things. This understanding the law that relative to negligence and protecting houses of worship is where I'm going to stick to. So you need to contact your own attorney if you even have one, right? That you can speak to these things. But these next definitions are central to our going forward. What is negligence? It starts with you have a duty to care. You don't have to protect everything, right? But here's where it gets complicated with churches. You're the host. You're asking the public to come here, right? Please, my doors are open. I want you to come in on Sunday. Very good, right? So as a host, you have a responsibility to like shovel the sidewalk, get rid of the ice, make sure things are safe. There's no carpets that are going to catch people and make them fall down and all that kind of stuff. So there's hazards that you're there to protect, right? A breach of duty is that you had a duty to act and you chose not to do anything. Now, when it talks about violence, most of the time you don't have you can defer this to local law enforcement, right? But that was yesterday. Today is not that way. We're seeing this giant spike in violence. And so the duty to care has just flipped. It's now going to the host. The host has to be prepared, right? Even at the most basic levels, you have to be prepared. Approximate cause, it means that you are part of the reason why it happened. Now, in New England, we have what's called comparative fault in all 6 states. And what that means is if somebody comes in and causes big problems in your church, right, commits an assault on a usher as a round number, that's just a general thing, right? Their attorney is going to, their tort attorney, not necessarily the criminal attorney, is going to try to find some level of fault in your congregation because you had a duty to care, but you breached that duty because you didn't do anything. And so we're going to add your insurance to the penalties that are being produced, if that makes sense. Let's see, we got from Timothy. If we have an outdoor service, trying to read it. Hang on. Okay, if we have an outdoor service on the church green, a protest or group interrupts, would the church be held liable based on a breach of duty or duty? Possibly, yes. That's not unusual because if you didn't put that service on, you're acting as a host, bringing them in. Would they have been there? Nah, maybe not, right? And so if you're a personal injury attorney, you very well might go after that. Now remember, there's a big split between penal law, criminal law, and tort, common law. They're not the same thing. They go in 2 different directions. Comparative fault is what usually ends up happening, which they call splitting the blame. So if this person is 90% their fault, but you could end up being stuck for 10% of this thing. And in some states, that could give you all of it if the other side doesn't have the ability to pay. Next slide, please. I don't want to get too crazy on the liability part because this is where your attorney comes in and they should be reviewing all this stuff. Insurance companies have big variations in their endorsements of how they write protection for security teams, and all the big church-focused insurance companies now have endorsements to cover this, which is really important. But the most important part here is I'm reading through, as I work through this, legal capacity. There's a couple of things involved. Please do not have someone who does not have legal capacity by the definition in your state involved in this ministry. This is not the place for 15 and 16-year-olds. They might be very mature. You do not want them going hands-on in the event of a medical emergency or an assault or something like that, a defensive posture, if they don't have legal capacity. And whatever you do, it needs to be written. You need to have records. This is super important. When I visit with multiple churches, most of the time there's no records, or if they're records, they're unusable. Next, please. I've heard this argued by law enforcement, this issue of vicarious liability. Imputed liability is generally how it's thought of. The standard of care. If your security group has armed citizens, they really do have a higher standard of care. Yes, we all have a Second Amendment right, and we have a universal right in the United States to defend yourself from grave bodily injury or imminent death. You have that right. But when it comes to firearms and actually going hands-on with somebody, like using defensive tactics, you do have a higher standard of care. Next, please.
Oh, let me just ask a couple of
Sure.
clarifying things. I think this would be a good opportunity, and maybe with my questions, if people have others, they can put them in if that's okay. So you talked about risk assessment, and you talked about other people that can do it for you, and getting a second opinion and stuff like that. So can you recommend, though, any type of risk assessment, like a checklist that would help a local church, kind of to do some of that themselves, and then start including people like their local fire department and police department and EMTs? Is that a good way for churches to approach some of this stuff?
It's a perfect starting point. The place to go get the original documents to start with this, right, is really Department of Homeland Security / CISA, CISA. And if you put CISA.gov, you'll go to them directly, right? And then you put in houses of worship, you're going to find an entire section on risk management for houses of worship. And inside of that is a very comprehensive risk assessment tool you can do yourself. It's a many pages long thing, because again, they're looking at everything from tiny to gigantic, right? They're not trying to scale it. And I found that particular document, the things that don't apply, just skip them, right? Just go right past it. But that one, that government one, is actually one of the best. Brotherhood Mutual has one also as part of their property, right? You can go on their site. Brotherhood Mutual will let you download one, right? It's shorter. It's not as comprehensive as the government one, right? But the same idea. So you now have a track to run on when your local fire chief comes over and walks through the building with you, and like, okay, he's got to do his fire inspection anyway. Well, let's look at it for real. What else is here, right? Now, what I've found is lots of times local law enforcement, they don't have time anymore to do these things. I'm going to be point blank about it, right? Think about your community. Almost every community in New England is looking for cops. Aren't enough of them, right? The academies are shorthanded. So you reach out and say, hey, can you give me a couple of hours and go through this? Sure. And they never show up. They haven't got time, right?
I get that. I do get that. But by the same token, and I'll just say, because we had one at our church in June, I believe, or no, it was August. I'm sorry. And we live in a small town, about 10,000. There's only 3 or 4 churches. But again, I think we just need to make sure we're encouraging people to reach out, because all it cost us was 5 dozen cookies. Because after the training, we had the police department there, the fire department there, and the EMTs. One person from each department came on a Saturday for 2 hours, and we had 20 people from our church. And we're on a Sunday morning, there's only 60 of us. So, I think we need to just underscore the fact that, yes, I agree with what you're saying, Dan, that they're, they're, underworked and, overworked and all of that. But they want to make a connection with faith-based organizations, and so I think we need to take advantage of that. We had to go after our folks. We had to keep reminding them. It took us a couple of months, but it was okay. It was all right. But we did make a connection. I'm just saying.
Very, very true.
Yeah.
And especially if one of your congregations is in, say, Boston or Hartford, right?
Yeah. Right.
Big cities, right?
Yeah.
Where
might be a little bit more difficult. I get that.
Well, besides the difficulty part, that's where their technical expertise of those larger police departments is really important, because their responses to some of these urban crimes that you might not see in your 10,000 person town, right? Is critical. I mean, they know that they have to be able to get through that building. And that's something we'll actually cover in the third part of in the physical stuff. I'll talk about it right now. It's really important that law enforcement or your local first responders have walked through your property. It's really, really important, because the call will go out someday saying, we need some help and we need it right now. And they need to know where the door is. They need to know where the ambulance can go. They need to know how they can breach a space if they had to, right? And the only way they're going to know that is to go through the building. And especially with, like in Maine, we have a lot of small churches. I mean, we have a lot of them.
That's the point.
I know one that I looked at a few years ago had this is war story stuff. I'll try to be quick. They had made it a log cabin like building, right? For the upstairs was the sanctuary. In the basement was where they kept all the children. Except the only way in and out of that basement was up one set of stairs.
Right.
And then they had like a Bilco door that might open or might not, right? Well, this is like a disaster waiting to happen, right? And they've been running things like this for a long time. The fire department know about it? Maybe not, right? But again, your options are limited when your money's tight. So anyway, let's jump to the next thing if we could. Let's see. So just be careful consideration. You decided to go forward. Next, please. How do you begin? This is super important. The top bullet. It needs to start with a written declaration from the elder board. As you well know, by how our churches are structured, most of them are incorporated. The elder boards basically own the church. In writing, they established the scope and limitations of where this safety and security thing might go. That's really important. The reason being is if they don't write it down and folks just start doing this on their own, the insurance company might not cover something that has not been expressly or authorized by the elder board. In essence, getting kind of fancy on the language, you're making an agency relationship. You're saying, I'm sending out these people as representing the board, right? And I want these things done. So what happens when they start doing things and the board didn't tell them to do it? Oops, we have a challenge, right? And so super important as you go forward, it starts at the elder board. Next, please. You need a leader. Here's where it normally starts. If you can find a law enforcement officer, a LEO as they're called, in your community, perfect. Perfect, because this fellow has already taken an oath to protect the community, right? And has access to resources that regular folks don't have, right? But my experience has been we can hang on to law enforcement officers only for a relatively short amount of time, and then they move on. And it's a very simple reason. If you do this every day of the week, you don't want to do it on your time off. It's that straightforward. Now, some guys, I know one of our church who did it for 12 years, wonderful man, unbelievable, right? But he did step down eventually, which was appropriate, right? His world just got more complicated. The next, if you can find someone who's got private security training, or experience, I should say, with weapons, right? That's a big thing. So the guy that's a flagger on the highway, that's not what I'm talking about. This is someone who actually knows how to patrol, knows how these things work, knows the laws within the states that they're going to operate in. Now, prior military folks, this gets interesting too. Generally speaking, I see a lot of the volunteers come forward that have had prior military experience, but some of their experience is not really relevant to this, right? So say you were in the Navy 45 years ago and you were a machinist, just as an example. Well, it's a good thing. I was in the Army a long time, but your experiences have to be relative to what we're trying to do, right? That would be better. If you have no security background at all, but are willing to learn, that in my experience is the best, believe it or not, outside of law enforcement. Those folks, they listen and learn, and they do good things. They put their heart right to it. How about if you enjoy violent recreation, specifically martial arts, weapons, you're a bouncer, this kind of thing? This one you have to be careful with, because these folks do volunteer. And sometimes they might be the only one you're going to get, in which case the elder board's got to be careful here. Is this really the guy I want? Do we want martial arts things going on? Do we want the guy who's a bouncer working at the Baptist church? I don't know. One step at a time. But the top one, again, law enforcement, and my own experience has been even if they have no background but are willing to learn, perfect. Next, please. Personal interviews, absolutely. You need to let natural, what are you going to call it? Intuition lead the way. Church membership should be absolutely required. And so if somebody's just joined the congregation 3 months ago and they just get out of the Marine Corps and you think it's all perfect, not yet. Not yet. They have to understand the culture and the doctrine of the congregation itself. This is super critical. I know I'm talking with the Baptist community now, but I talk with more than the Baptist community. And the cultural variances within our faith are enormous in New England, far larger than they are in other parts of the nation. This is a big deal. You have to be able to understand the culture of who you're working with. That will play itself out with weapons and actually how you're going to address the disruptive person. Now, background checks need to be done on the leader and literally everybody. I suggest you use this particular company, protectmyministry.com. And there's a reason why. There's multiple companies that do this background checking. This is the only one that can pull in overseas information. They have the ability to look literally everywhere. And you want to know that, because you really don't want somebody getting connected to you that you think is clean, but in reality, in a whole nother place, in a whole nother country, they were a problem. Then you're back to the duty to care. Did you have an act? Did you have a duty to act? Yep, you did. And it was to check the background of this person. And instead they got inside the operation. Next, please. This is a warning. Don't use the police computer to run background checks. It gets done because it saves a lot of money, right? It's a crime. Accessing the NCIS system, you have to have credentials and a reason to do it. And if the officer that does this gets caught, he'll lose his job. Not worth it. If the church needs a background check, contact Protect My Ministry and they'll take care of it. Next, please. After you found that leader, what are the priorities? Next. When I was in the service, my final jobs, I should say, go backwards slightly, was what's called a tactical operations officer. I was a planner and trainer. But it's super, from my perspective, it's super important to start with a plan first that volunteer leader came up with, along with the other stakeholders in the church, whoever they might be. And then you start looking for the people that fit that. If you start recruiting too many people and you don't have a plan yet, you might be recruiting the wrong ones. They might seem obvious, but They might not be who you want. It's better to be fussy on this one. The training will ultimately match the mission. So whatever you scope the mission to be, you're going to match the training to fit that, not the other way around. Frequently, that's what happens. We start out with an end product in mind, right? And then we just start bolting things together. We really want to say, okay, what do we really want to do? We want to focus on evacuations, medical, whatever it might be, and we build it out from there. Next, please. This is my priority list. And most of the other folks that are professionals at this, they see this pretty close. The number one thing is a building evacuation plan. Even if you get nothing else out of tonight, if you don't have a written, practiced building evacuation plan, you need to do that. That's a primary thing. How are you going to get the kids? Like I gave an example of that log church, right? How are you going to get the kids out of the basement if there's a fire in the one staircase that's there? How are you going to do this? This is a disaster, right? How are you going to reconnect the Sunday school classes if you have a moderate sized church, say it's about 200 people and you have 40 kids in Sunday schools? How are you going to reconnect with their parents after we did a big evacuation? All these things have to be thought out ahead of time. Next thing is medical emergencies. It's a couple of ways to handle this. I've been refining my thinking. I used to be a street medic. I'm an advanced EMT and all this kind of stuff. I've done it for many years, but my thinking is starting to shrink. If we have a 911 event, you have a 911 event. You can't really fix that at the church, right? It's just not possible. There is a couple of things you can do something about, which you should be trained on. CPR, an AED, right? Those things kind of go hand in hand. And then severe bleeding. If you had some sort of a penetrating injury where a person could bleed to death, you can respond to those things and save a life with some very rudimentary training. Doesn't take much to do that. And then the rest of the medical stuff, 911, not a big deal. And you want to have a good medical kit, like the kind of a kit that actually is not something from Walmart. But there's a company called My Medic that I use that everything is current, everything works. And I highly encourage you to, if you do have medical supplies, you take a look at the expiration dates. When I go looking at these things, and half the time the stuff is unusable for medical purposes. It needs to be trashed. And because it was expensive, you kept it. Throw it away. You don't put old medical stuff on people. Disruptive behavior response is something that has to be practiced and thought out. Like, just how deep do you want to go with this? Are you prepared to go hands-on with somebody or not? And if not, there's training that has to be done. Child protection procedures, again, number 4 on the list. It's a big one. So now we have your hosting families, you have their children there, and you have single moms who have protection orders. Some of you guys don't know what I'm talking about, right? You need to have a copy of that protection order, because whoever is on that order, if they come and take the child, it's kidnapping, and you don't want to be a party to that. It's a super sensitive thing, and it happens frequently. One church in Maine just stopped a child abduction over the summertime. Just by being savvy, paying attention, they got the job done. It's a very common thing. Child protection procedures need to be thought out, scaled to who you have. You only have 3 kids in Sunday school. Well, it's easy. If you have 300, it's a different story. And then a weapons policy. Now, Massachusetts is a lot different than the other states, but people are carrying guns. You can guarantee it. You got people carrying guns in your congregation. It's a highly sensitive subject, whether you bring it up or not. So next slide, please. How many people do you need? Well, Sandy just brought a good example. We got about 60 on Sunday, right? So small congregation in New England. Sunday, 75 people or less. You want at least 2 safety/security folks. 2. Why? If you send one person to resolve a problem and they get taken out, you have a much bigger problem. You want to have two. There's an old-fashioned police procedure called contact and cover. Some of you folks might have, if you have law enforcement background, know something about this. We send a person out, but there's a cover person. So there's someone communicating, but there's a cover person, right? You don't want to have one person dealing with a dangerous event. It's just not good. If possible, you want to have a third person. I prefer, if you can recruit a female, please do that. Please. When I have to address any kind of an issue with females, I have to go find another female to stand next to me while I'm treating them or communicating or whatever it is. But there's no way in the planet that I'm going to be advising a female one-on-one in a church environment. It's not going to happen. And so you need to have that resource that's available just for the legal protection of your own people, right? Integrating with the ushers, the greeters, altar workers. This is absolutely vital. This has to be done. I've seen it done both ways where they're kind of kept separate, but in my opinion, they need to be all together. In the event of an evacuation, for example, say there's smoke in the church, right? It's not even a fire, it's just smoke. You need those ushers to make sure these doors are open. Think back to a few years ago in Rhode Island, there was a fire in a nightclub where all these people died because folks stacked up on top of themselves at the exits and couldn't get out of the building. Do you remember any of this? Some folks might. It's super common. In the event of a big problem, and smoke, fire, it's a big problem, people will do that. If they fall down, they will step on each other. They don't necessarily know to help the others, right? Now, if you're talking about a traditional 75 person or less small New England church, I'm going to guess there's probably at least 10 elderly people in that congregation, just a guess, right? They're not going to move as fast as the 20-year-olds. They're just not going to. My church actually brings in special needs people that have MS or significant disabilities. They're in wheelchairs and they have a caregiver with them all the time, right? Mm-hmm. You have to plan for this. If you have folks like that, the safety and security guys need to plan for their evacuation. Next, please. Why is it special? This is going to sound arrogant, but this is possibly outside of the pastor. This is the most highly trained ministry in the church. The folks that you establish for this have got to maintain some pretty expensive tools. They have to maintain proficiency and they're ready to go all the time. It's not easy to do, and you burn people out. There's a definite burnout factor to church security folks. I'm fortunate to have been doing it for a long time. Well, we've had significant turnover because this is a hard one. This is a hard one. So the team you start with is not necessarily going to be the one you're always going to have. It's just hard to do. Next, please. So there's some of the boundaries. You want to have boundaries to weapons use, which goes state to state, right? Who's going to respond to a medical situation? You need some boundaries to that too. You have the Good Samaritan laws, which allow anybody to help anybody, right? But you really want it to be handled appropriately. So in other words, if we have to do CPR on somebody and we're ripping open clothes and we're doing some exposure things, you really want to have plans for that, right? That's just what it is. Disruptive behavior, same thing. Boundaries. Almost every congregation these days has behavior challenged children in it, put it that way. They're in special needs school situations. They need to be handled appropriately. I'm kind of running out of time. Counseling. One of the biggest physical threats inside of churches is counseling advice that goes sideways. And the angry spouse, the angry whatever, comes back and is looking for their pound of flesh out of whoever it was that told my wife or my husband to leave me. This is like a common thing, which leads to the final stuff. You need to have someone, your security lead needs to be able to do what we call work under the rose. That's the phrase for it. Working under the rose means that you can hear things, but you can never repeat them. Never. Similar to what a pastor maintains for confidentiality. But that security person needs to know if we have a truly dangerous event going on, pastor needs to be able to know we can communicate to somebody and we can mitigate that danger. But that person, that chief, keeps their mouth shut, right? About only the details they need to know. Let's see here. Let me try to read this.
Well, there are a couple of
Yep.
questions here, Dan. So let's
Yep.
let's talk for a few minutes, because I think that
Yep.
that we need to remember that most of the people that we're dealing with here in New England are churches under 50.
Yep.
So the startup's going to be small.
Yep.
And also, one of the things you mentioned about getting elders to approve things, most churches that we have here in New England don't have elders. So they have congregational forms of government. And
Yep.
so they're going to have to deal with that in a different way. So, so again, I think, just reminding people here that, small churches are going to do the little baby steps, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Whoever their ownership is, I guess the heart of my suggestion, Sandy, is that
Yep.
get it in writing. Get it in
Correct.
writing.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that somebody doesn't get ahead of their skis, just
Yep.
gets enthusiastic and starts doing things. And
Right.
the next thing you know, they get sued, right?
Correct.
Because they
Right.
went where they're not supposed to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you can see, you're right about, can you give a recommendation on how to get training in security? Sure. That's what we're going to be. This is a 3-part process, Mr. TJ, Timothy Gast. And we're going to do a physical security training event in the beginning of November.
Yep.
Through BCNE. So you can get started there. There's other training events that are happening. But yes, part of what I do is I use I rent the Romney Bible Conference Center 4 times a year, and we do this kind of very specific physical training that's required to be good at it. And the actually good question here from Doris: should the parsonage be looked at the same way? Ooh, that's a really good question. The church owns the parsonage, right? So it's not the pastor's property, right? But the pastor has property in the parsonage, right? Yes, absolutely. You have a vested interest in that building. You don't want it burning down. You don't want it having problems and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, it's the right thing to do. And on top of that, most parsonages are very close to the building itself, or very close to the church, right? And so if there's a physical hazard in the parsonage, it could very well burn down the church also, or do something like that, right? So that kind of makes sense. My last thing I've got here is the next steps, which is our time is up. The next time we get together, if you choose to join us, we're going to talk specifically about how to write these documents, what they look like, right? And how to work through these things I've been talking about. So tonight was really about, to summarize it, why do you want to do this? And if you do want to do this, go with your eyes open. This is what we're going to do. It needs to happen, in my opinion. It needs to happen in every congregation now. Mm-hmm. It's just getting way too crazy. And even like Sandy's talking about small congregations, even some really small ones are seeing horrific events happen. And we have to take responsibility for it, be intentional about it. So with that, Sandy, what have you got online here? Let me see if I can get that.
That's correct. So yeah, and we say this all the time. BCNE is very outspoken when it comes to safety and security in churches, because we know that most churches don't have anything in place whatsoever. So that's our heart here, is to do these sessions because we want to help you get prepared. And we can send you some resources when it comes to how to develop a safety and security plan. Our police department, actually, when they came, they actually gave us samples. And I think Dan says you have some too. And we can certainly send those to you, so that, and we'll send them out, because when we get back together on the 27th, on the 29th of September, perhaps you'll have some time to kind of look at that and begin to put some things down on paper, and Dan can kind of maybe help you along the way with some of that stuff. But we certainly can give you resources. But we at the BCNE, we say all the time that every one of your volunteers needs to be background checked, and not just the person that Dan's talking about, whoever your safety and security person is, but every single person in your church that works with children or teenagers absolutely needs to be background checked by a national background check, not just a local one. There are lots of them out there, but certainly Protect My Ministry is a really, is certainly a good one to get into. So, we're right on board with all of that type of stuff. But again, there are some resources out there, your local departments, but also your insurance company. Dan mentioned this before too, that your insurance company is a good resource as well. And you should understand and know what you'll be liable for. And your insurance company will come out and talk to you as well, so that you have the right coverages. And if you have Church Mutual, Guidestone, or Brotherhood Mutual, those are all church based insurance companies, so they know what churches need. So we have these resources that we need to make sure that we're being a part of. So that this is happening on the 29th, and then on November 5th is the Saturday. We're going to be having a 9 to 3, and that's going to be practical, like, right, Dan?
Yes. Yep. This is hands-on, scenario-based learning as you go. And Sandy's working on us using an actual church. Yeah. Not just like a building, but a church, which makes a big difference.
Yeah. Where the BCNE is, there's a church building that's offered to let us use it, so we may decide to go there. That'll be a very practical day. So, and again, that might be a good place to start. You've heard, Dan's really underscored the fact that we really need to be doing something. So I hope, if nothing else, that, and put this in the chat, what's one takeaway from tonight that you'll go back and start thinking about doing tonight? Is it finding that person that could be part of your safety and security team? Maybe it's starting an evacuation plan. But write that in the chat. Let us know if this was helpful, and also if something that you might decide to do based on what we've talked about tonight. So be sure to put that in the chat for us. And if you have any other questions, we'll hang out here for a minute or two and watch the chat for those.
Is it okay, Sandy, if folks contact me through my business?
Yeah, I think we had your information up here. I think I had it right there. It's
pretty simple.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
This is a business that loses money every day of the week. I'm doing this as a ministry, more or less. And I do travel, and I consider it an honor to be able to assist congregations in New England. Right. I lived a long time, and I'm thankful I've been able to do that. And so this is a good thing.